So hey guys, welcome back to another video on the channel. It's been a while since I've posted, I think almost 2 weeks now, but I'll be back on my regular posting schedule from now on. So make sure you subscribe and you don't miss out any future videos. So in this video, I'll be talking about the recent tech layoffs that have been ongoing. So a lot of companies have been laying off people. So we're going to talk about that. This will be a bit of an unusual format. So it's more like just a story time, like where I'm just talking to a camera. Whereas like usually I show like some diagrams or like some screen share on my screen. But this one, I'll just be thinking out my thoughts, what I think about the layoffs, and we're going to structure it into 3 parts. First, we're going to talk about how this whole layoff stuff started, how is it going currently, and who is being impacted by it. So first, let's begin with how this all started. In order to understand this, we need to backtrack to when the pandemic started, or just before the pandemic. So just before the pandemic, I think that was in early 2019. A lot of these technical digital businesses were going as usual. But then after the pandemic hit and after lockdown was imposed on everyone, so everyone was working from home, schools were canceled, schools were being done online now, and almost like a majority of the chunk of the work people do moved to online work or remote work. And this was all around, I think, late 2019, early mid 2020. In this time period, what happened was all these tech companies, these digital services, companies that provide these digital tools, their business skyrocketed. So because everyone's now online, the numbers that they're pulling are insane. Like for example, I can speak for Microsoft, like for Microsoft Teams. So I'll show a chart on the screen of like the amount of users that Microsoft Teams gained just in the pandemic. Now, everyone working from home, schools being conducted online, work, business meetings, so on, everyone is using digital services. So what this means for businesses is that now they're pulling in a lot of new numbers, like massive amount of chunks, like Zoom just skyrocketed, Microsoft Teams, like these communication platforms, as well as like other online services, everything just skyrocketed. Within like this environment now where digital businesses are booming, tech companies started to pull in a lot of revenue and they wanted to expand. Now they want to build further. They want to do product evolution. They want to improve, enhance their services. So they started hiring people, and they hired people at a crazy rate because the numbers that they were pulling were super crazy because of the pandemic. And I mean, this goes both ways. So first, the pandemic affected company was a net gain for companies because of the high amount of traffic, for digital companies at least, the high amounts of traffics they were gaining. But on the other hand, it also meant inflation, and it also meant not good for the economy, which will link back later into like how the economic state of the world also is now contributing to the tech layoffs. But essentially what these tech companies did was they hired massive amounts of people simultaneously in order to expand and enhance their products. Now they have this huge chunk of like new workforce. Like for example, for Microsoft, or I think for Google as well, they each hired I think 30,000 or 30,000 respectively new employees, which was a massive surplus in their headcount. What this meant was once the pandemic or the peak of the pandemic was over, like when people like the remote work option started to go down, people started going doing in-person activities more. These remote services, all these remote businesses, the traffic just wasn't there. The amount of numbers they were pulling, it just wasn't there. So what was happening is they couldn't sustain this amount of like new employee batch that they hired, just because they're not pulling in that much money. So they're losing on average when you average out per employee, because of like now with the pandemic, less people are using online services, less revenue is being generated by these online services, and so there's less money to pay people. This is one major factor, is overhiring. Or I wouldn't say overhiring. Obviously, companies, they've thought through all this. Like when the pandemic comes down, a lot of companies, what they do is like they hire contractors. So like on a temporary position, that's also one solution for this. But obviously, companies have thought about this. But this is one definite factor, was just this mass amount of hiring that was done during the pandemic. The second thing we need to look at is the war in Ukraine, because that changed this international economic sphere a lot. Now, I am not exactly aware of the situation per se, but I can tell you that had ripple effects in the global economy. Like for example, where I live in Canada, oil like diesel, gas prices were super high. I mean, they still are relative to like 2-3 years ago, or 4 or 5 years ago, and just a lot of inflation, a lot of stuff being a high price now, which is also another contributor. Because if you look at these companies, the amount of assets, the amount of like people that they're supporting now just became more expensive to do. And that is also a major contribution to why companies are now being forced to lay off people, is just the sheer amount of this global economic inflation, you would say, or this, I don't know, recession, or I mean, not really a recession per se, but just this global economic collapse, I would say. Like, I'll put it at that, but quotation marks. But that's also one major factor. Now, if you look at it, what's actually happening, if you look at it like from a wide lens of the world, overall companies had a net gain. I mean, Twitter aside, a lot of companies, they hired, but they didn't fire or they didn't lay off as much as they hired. So for example, Microsoft or Google, they hired about 30,000 people, but they only laid off, I think, around 10 to 15. But overall, if you look at it, it is a net positive in like the overall job market. Like, a lot of new people were hired. But then again, we return back to our third point of the video, which was who's suffering now. So there have been a couple people who I know personally that have been affected by this. Fortunately, my team has not been affected by this yet. And I hope so. That is the case, that we all get to continue to have our jobs. But some people that I do know, not at Microsoft, but some other companies, they were affected by this and they lost their jobs. So this is a super hard time for a lot of people, because you think about it, like everyone's like payments, their house payments, rents, whatever, like their whole family is like surviving based of this one source of income that they have, which is their job. And to lose that suddenly, because it's not like because most of the layoffs are unexpected layoffs, like mass layoffs. So a lot of people are being laid off simultaneously. And I'm sure you've probably like seen on LinkedIn many stories about people being laid off, and their and like their experience, like no notice, no anything, just an email, and they lose their access to their accounts and so on. But yeah, overall, I just wanted to make a video. This one, I honestly didn't thought of it that much. Just turned on my camera and just wanted to talk about this. I will do another podcast episode, so be sure to, I'll link my podcast down in the description. So be sure to follow that. I'll do someone with industry professionals in the tech industry who can speak more on the specifics of this tech layoff, how overall globally this is affecting, how this will affect futures, how this will affect the future. Because if you think about it, now companies are laying off. So think about all the people who have graduated this year who are now looking to get jobs. People who already had jobs, they're having a hard time finding jobs. So what about people who have no experience at all? So there's a lot of consequences, a lot of stuff to talk about. So I'll do that in a detailed podcast episode. But for now, this was it. Be sure to subscribe so you don't miss out my daily uploads. And I'll see you guys in the next one.